Dr. Viral Acharya is the CV Star Professor of Economics in the Department of Finance at NYU Stern University and an academic advisor to the Federal Reserve Banks of New York and Philadelphia. He was the Deputy Governor at RBI from 2017 to 2019, in charge of monetary policies, financial markets, financial stability, and research. He also held prominent positions at NSE, Western Finance Association and Advisory, and also held prominent position at NSE, BSE, Financial and Industrial Regulation Authority, Center for Advanced Financial Research and Learning. Dr. Viral Acharya completed his Bachelor of Technology degree from IIT Bombay in 1995. Thereafter, he has done his PhD from NYU Stern in 2001. Beyond his professional work, Dr. Viral Acharya is fond of music. He has composed a music album titled Yaadon Ke Silsile. Now I would like to introduce the topic of Fireside Chat for which we are gathered here. It is on deglobalization, geopolitics, and its impact on global financial market. Since pandemic, we have witnessed changes in the policies at geopolitical stage because of the disruption in global supply chain and commercial activities. The following discussion will be moderated by Professor Chetan Subramanian. He is a professor in the Department of Economics at IIM Bangalore. His research interests lie in monetary economics, financial markets, and departmental economics. In 2023, he was appointed as RBI Chair Professor in Economics for 3 years. Now I would like to hand over the stage to our esteemed guest and moderator. Give them a round of applause. Thank you.
First of all, good evening to all, and welcome to our guest, Professor Viral Acharya. Viral, of course, needs no introduction. Stellar career. So I'll get right down to it, Viral. So the 2008 crisis, the US-China trade war in 2018, the COVID-19 pandemic, the Russia-Ukraine war, recent political developments in the US and Europe have investors worried about deglobalization. In other words, is the world becoming less interconnected? So my first question is, do you view this deglobalization as a permanent or largely a transient phenomena? Are companies simply diversifying their supply chains away from China, the so-called China plus one strategy, to countries like Vietnam, Mexico, perhaps even India? And is the fall in trade growth, for example, that one is seeing in some data for China, is simply China moving up the value chain? In other words, it's moving up the value chain in manufacturing, it's moving increasingly into services. You would expect to see less trade. Is that what's happening? In other words, it's not deglobalization, but as some people have called it, globalization.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, very kind of you to be here on a Saturday evening. So I hope I can make it worth your while. And thank you, Chetan, for preparing this great set of questions. So let me make 3 points to just put it in the context. I don't have a firm grip on which of the various things you mentioned the current trends might be, but it might be just worth appreciating what's been going on. My sense is that essentially the world is still dealing with the entry of China on the global landscape. It was a huge sort of awakening of a large potential manufacturing giant in the 80s. It clearly started displacing factories and labor in the United States manufacturing and in the rest of the world, right since China entered. And my assessment is that for a while, it didn't create the kind of rumblings that we've had in the last 16, 17 years since the global financial crisis, because it was working to the world's advantage for a while. You know, China was basically manufacturing low inflation for the Western economies. Even though they were dealing with the problem of loss of jobs, they were throwing financial band-aids to deal with that. Notably, United States was basically making cheap housing available 80s, 90s, early 2000s, basically as a financial palliative to deal with the fact that US was not able to replace manufacturing that was moving to China with a movement upward of its own workforce in higher skills, higher tech, and other kinds of jobs. And for a while, it worked fine. The housing was on a tear. So people didn't mind because as long as house prices kept going up, you could draw down home equity and keep consuming out of it. They made the housing available all the way down to the bottom of the pyramid at the subprime level. And so US could continue to manufacture low inflation. US companies could continue to do their cost cutting, etc., by moving their manufacturing hubs over to China. And politically, even though there was always a little bit of discontent about all this, there was lack of trust, China being geopolitically a bit interestingly poised relative to the US. But because everything was going well, no one really started talking about the fact that, oh, we have a new manufacturing giant on the scene. It's causing some big ramifications in our economy. But as long as it was manufacturing low inflation and you could deal with the other parts through financial palliatives, US just kept going on with this. So that sort of, I think it's important to keep this at the back of mind that the US voters have not been told that for 3 decades, low inflation was getting manufactured for them, partly by actually moving manufacturing over to China. Now, what happened then was that one, the financial palliatives stopped being that easily available because the housing markets crashed. So they had to actually resort to monetary stimulus, quantitative easing, a large buildup of fiscal expenditures, first after the global financial crisis, then after COVID. And so now the costs have started bearing themselves on the balance sheet of the US economy. Initially, because of housing bubble, the costs were not actually being seen. But once the bubble burst, the costs are now being seen on the US economy. And of course, then some political party will capture that fact that, okay, we are paying a big price for the fact that China has entered the world scene. It's trading in a big way. And, it has done partly by using its exchange rate policy, using its state-owned enterprises, et cetera, et cetera. So I think to me, that's like the US backdrop, which is that the discontent of loss of jobs in hinterlands of America, the Rust Belt, the Steel Belt, et cetera, is now actually obvious. It's obvious also on the balance sheet of the United States as high debt that it has had to incur in order to deal with the global financial crisis and then the COVID shock. And then there is a party or a group of people who are championing that as their way of trying to reform the way the US is for the rest. So that's sort of, I see that as the longer undercurrent of what's happening in the US. On the second side, I would say that the change in the political leadership in China with Premier Xi coming in power, to me, has been a decisive turning point of this relationship. Because just the way President Trump in the United States has altered the rules of the game, my sense is Xi also altered the rules of the game by saying, listen, China was opening up within the limitations of it being still organized around one party. It was opening up, it was becoming more of a market-based economy. Foreign investors, foreign companies were all pouring in to manufacture there, to fund investments over there. But I think even before the US onslaught through the Trump tariffs on China, she had already started making China. Companies had started fearing the slightly capricious nature of policies under Premier Xi, even before actually Donald Trump was elected in the United States. And so gradually that lack of investment, excitement about China started reaching Washington, D.C. And the reason why finally President Trump's administration was able to undertake tariffs and like an open sort of a tariff war on China is because the US companies actually didn't fight it. They said, yeah, if now the US government wants to go and do a tariff war with China, it's a good time because we are actually gradually pulling back ourselves because of the change in the political scene in China. So my sense is that the discontent against China and that it was leading to loss of jobs was always there in the United States. But as long as China was a trustworthy partner in terms of its own leadership and opening up of markets, the US companies were keeping the US administration at bay, saying, no, we are still going in and investing there. You can't really take on this war. But now they are back in their CEO rooms keeping quiet because they actually don't think that the tariff war is that costly for the US businesses. So that's the second point, which is that gradually the change of political scene and what it means for predictability of doing business in China has meant that businesses in the Western world are no longer holding back their administrations from taking on China on an open tariff war. The third part of it, though, which is the most interesting to me, is that even though United States would like to think that it's large enough to engage in a big tariff war, my sense is the rest of the world is too big relative to the United States. What I mean by that is that if they try to basically impose tariffs which are sort of directed towards one country, then the rest of the world, it will take some time, but they will just reorganize the supply chains, even to beat around the fact that a large economy like the US is going after another large economy like China. The rest of the world, in my view, is still big enough to actually reorganize around all of this. In the end, what it does is that the goods ultimately reach the US one way or the other. On some items, the tariffs will bind and it will raise the cost of those goods for the United States, just the way it's costly for us to bring in Samsung and Apple phones, etc., or TVs, because we have very high tariffs on these things in India. So we end up paying higher for high quality goods. US consumers will end up paying higher prices for some of these goods. Some other things will find their way through Mexico, Canada, other parts of the supply chains. Maybe US will increase tariffs on some of those borders as well. So in the end, I think all that's going to happen is that probably not much nearshoring will happen. It's likely goods will just find other ways to come through. Maybe the higher prices mean that some things can be produced by US companies internally. I still believe in fundamentally in there being core competencies in different countries in different things. I don't think US has a core advantage in manufacturing, in my view, because labor is just very expensive. The unemployment insurance and other things that you have to provide, the minimum wage, etc., mean that essentially to produce a good in US is much more expensive than in other parts where labor can be hired much more cheap. So I think to me, they should look up to India to see what tariffs do to an economy, which is you impose high tariffs, you internally the goods you get are of lower quality, you have domestic tigers, but they are not producing anything that's of global brands. And whatever comes from outside is at higher prices. So your consumer is actually effectively facing higher inflation than what they need in their overall consumption basket. I think the same thing will hit the United States consumers, in my view. I think the tariff wars in 1819 were a bit chaotic because it was a new administration. They were still trying to find their feet on the ground. Right now, they seem like all well prepared to go all in. And so probably the impact on global trade and its rerouting through global supply chains, the increase in prices for the US consumers, flooding of the US market with some low quality domestic products will all happen now, perhaps for a longer period than it happened in the first Trump administration. Overall, it just seems to me like a bad global scenario. So I don't know whether it's deglobalization or globalization, etc. It just seems like a bad scenario for basically undoing the advantages of the trade benefits that we had. Because ultimately what US needs to do is to figure out what its displaced workforce can do. I think there has been a lack of political will in the US to improve education, reduce health costs, do occasional training for the kind of jobs that the US can still provide, slightly up the higher chain. I think it required reskilling, education, etc. But that those things are tougher to do. And US, unfortunately, when it couldn't create jobs, resorted exactly to what other parts of the world do, which is to throw money at the problem, which is let's just give subsidies, let's just give unemployment insurance, let's just give housing credit and things like that. So I think both parties are a bit to blame in my view, both the United States as well as China for having reached this point. But when I talk to some of the more balanced and sober economists in the US, the sense they have is that they are far more worried about global trade and inflation under Trump administration than anything.
Yeah, no, actually, that's allows me to segue right up to the second question, which is that while this reorganization takes place, there are going to be supply chain disruptions. There are also threats of restrictions on movements on labor. For instance, I think there are recent news reports that suggest that even sectors in India, for example, that rely heavily on China, such as electronics, solar panels, etc., are facing severe challenges in getting capital equipment, with China halting supplies. So as you correctly pointed out, I mean, this is all inflationary. So is the world in for a period of high inflation?
Yeah, I struggle a little bit with that, because I think we have to keep thinking through like all the second order effects. And I think it's like two very large strategic players competing against each other. So my sense is that in the first round, the US will likely have an inflation effect. Maybe the American exceptionalism for a short while will mean that they'll deregulate, they will do some other things to rejuvenate their industries to deal with that. Maybe that's the reason why dollar is getting stronger. But I think the one big question we have to ask is, what will be China's big reaction to it? And I fear that at some point they will basically do massive monetary stimulus. They'll do big rounds of quantitative easing. They are simultaneously dealing with a very big housing and debt problem overall in the economy, both at household level, public-owned corporation level, at municipal levels, etc. So it's only the federal balance sheet in China that now doesn't look debt-laden. But effectively it is, because China has no market mechanisms to deal with debt. So all debt is going to get socialized gradually back up to the federal level. So even though the federal debt may look like just 65% and all the rest of the debt looks like 250%, everything may just become at federal level eventually. So China will probably try to do massive quantitative easing, devaluation of its currency. Maybe they will start dumping whatever they can in different parts of the world. And so in some ways, I fear that for the rest of the world, it's a very complicated situation, because on the one hand, you're dealing with a strong dollar, which weakens your currency and results in some imported inflation on the one hand, while simultaneously another big trading giant will be dumping whatever they can in various markets, causing deflationary pressures on the other side. I have difficulty right now thinking how this is going to play out. It just, bottom line seems to be that it may be just a whole lot of uncertainty for a while until we see which of the two behemoths sort of either wins, or maybe they both lose, and then they sit down together and try to come up with some truce so that it's not painful for them and for the rest of the world overall. But I think we have to wait and see. I have a feeling that we can't underestimate that China will also retaliate in some big way. Right now, the focus is all on US and President Trump, maybe because he's more in your face, but China could actually start acting under the surface in a big way.
Okay, so picking up on that comment on the strong dollar, of course, one of the things that's been happening is strong dollar means other currencies have been depreciating, including the rupee. And I think there is some criticism about the RBI recently that it has been excessively conservative in managing the rupee, which has sort of restricted liquidity and, of course, hurt growth. Do you think that the RBI has been too conservative in managing the rupee? Do you think they should have allowed the rupee to sort of depreciate more freely?
So I think RBI's stated policy has always been that they aren't trying to target a particular level. They always manage excessive volatility. But of course, you have to come up with a definition of what is excessive volatility. If you look at rupee's exchange rate volatility just based on simple volatility calculations, do some kind of gauge or even a simple realized volatility metric, I think rupee's volatility in the last 2 years, barring the last 2 months, was extraordinarily low. Yes. So much so that actually when I looked at the NYU VLab website and I saw that rupee vol was 1.5%, I had to confirm whether it was monthly or annual vol that I was looking at. And it was actually annual vol. So that's a remarkably low vol. So I think that reveals that probably the intervention was very, very high, probably. One interpretation I have heard from some is that perhaps it adopted this policy to support government's foray into infrastructure over the last few years. They wanted to allow government funding to come in for that, and that the exchange rate wall being killed was basically telling this large foreign investor that at least for a while you don't have to worry about having come into the market at a bad time. I don't know if that's the case, but I've heard that policy on the table. One other thing that my experience seems to show is that even though the stated policy is one of excessive vol, because there is no clear model of what excessive vol is, unfortunately, people at the helm start thinking about a specific level in their mind, and they just start targeting that. Of course, the joke is that for some time, I think during taper tantrum, I'm just trying to make things a bit light, so it doesn't remain too heavy all the time. But I think this is true. During taper tantrum, I think the rupee level crossed the then Prime Minister's age. So the person in opposition, who is now the Prime Minister, of course, commented about it in the parliamentary hearings and all that. And then, of course, the tables turned. And, that time the person in opposition was the Prime Minister. But then the rupee started crossing his age. And there was great pressure from the finance ministry to defend the rupee from crossing that important level. Because now then Prime Minister, who was now in opposition, would have commented about it in the parliament. So, in India, all kinds of considerations become important. And the most important one is what will get said in the parliament and get reported in the headlines of the newspaper. But what I'm trying to say is that there are these weird levels that sometimes become important. They should not be, in my view. RBI, in my view, should try to use some model to come up with a notion of excessive vol. But it looks from all the data that they did probably kill the vol. In my view, the real problem with killing the vol is that essentially importers, basically when they see a low vol like that, they just stop hedging. They say, at 1.5% annual vol, what's the point of paying a hedging premium to the bankers? They just sit. Maybe if RBI changes its policy and vol increases, maybe we can worry about it that time. And, if situation gets very bad, they do have a big stock of reserves, they will come in and defend the rupee anyways. So you start building in a little bit of private moral hazard on the importer side. And usually that is what happens, which is that at some point the peg has to let go because it's infeasible to defend it beyond a point. And that's what has happened. The dollar has strengthened a lot, so the rupee is depreciating. And then suddenly there's a lot of discussion because a lot of people had not been hedging, saying, okay, within 2 months, there'll be 2 to 3 rupees depreciation of the rupee. They are not prepared for that. And then they start saying, oh, everyone has mismanaged this. But of course, everyone is partly to blame because RBI may have killed the vol too much. creating incentives for people not to hedge. Of course, people chose not to hedge, and therefore they are now suddenly exposed as importers, including maybe the oil marketing companies and so on. You know, they will also be bearing losses because government can't just start raising oil prices very quickly, very soon. So they have to then absorb a little bit of the loss. Ultimately, the government bears the cost because it reduces the dividends that these companies pay to the government one way or the other. But in my view, I think one reason to keep a healthy level of vol in the rupee or any emerging market exchange rate is that you want to have a first line of defense through private hedging. And then only if the vol becomes so high that it's going to break through the defenses from that so that the rollover of the hedge is going to become very expensive, then the central bank should come in and actually reduce the rollover costs at that point. But I'm still not too worried about the rupee, I would say, at a macro level, because I think even though there's been a slower growth print, capital flows have been in the reverse direction, private investments are not looking that great. But still, overall, Indian macro is, I would say, not as exuberant as it was maybe last 3 years, but it's stable, especially given what's happening in China, what's happening in the rest of the world. And I think RBI has enough defenses. It employs a large number of capital macroprudential controls so that hot money outflows in a short period of time won't be that large. So I think it may have erred a little bit in the direction of killing the vol, but overall, I would say it's still in a very fine place to secure exchange rate stability. So I would say it's a little bit of a storm in a teacup rather than something big to worry about in the macro.
A slightly different topic. So, you know, globalization has often been criticized for worsening wealth and income inequality. In fact, that's been one of the key pushbacks against globalization, concentration of wealth, for example. So my question is, do you see deglobalization, which is the reverse of this, and the restrictions on labor force, for example, expediting things like automation, you know, use of AI? And if that happens, what do you think will happen to inequality? There's a sense that perhaps it might actually get worse than get better.
No, I think this is a terrific point to think about. And that's why I wanted to start with the backdrop I gave of what's been happening in the US. So I think what the tariff war mongers with is the fact that the US companies embraced China's entry in manufacturing. They wanted to do cost cutting. They want to compete and sell products at cheaper prices because that's the way they try to get a bigger share of the market. So in a capitalist society, that's one way that firms compete, which is to offer same product for a cheaper price, or maybe even better products at cheaper prices by exploiting arbitrages in global factors of production. So what they're not appreciating is that if you put tariffs and make imports of foreign goods more expensive, and US manufacturing is not as cheap to manufacture the same products, these companies will do cost cutting by riding up the automation curve even faster. They'll use AI, 3D printing, robots, whatever tools are available to do these things. And it therefore, in the end, may not result in as many nearshoring benefits as they are marketing to the MAGA sentiment that is picking up in the United States among the displaced job hinterlands of the United States. And in the end, they'll be facing the same problem. Either you have to throw more financial palliatives at the displaced laborers, or you have to finally come and embrace the problem that the only way out is to actually invest in lowering health costs. So either you improve the manufacturing scene in the US, you have to reduce unemployment insurance and other costs of the companies, or you have to move these workers through reskilling, education, etc., up the value chain where the US still has jobs. I'm told in biotech, US can still create 3 million jobs if it wants, but you have to move the university output in that direction by hiring more people and training them for the availability of jobs that is out there in the United States. So my sense is that some of this might just be the fact that US has not embraced the right reforms to deal with China's entry into the world trade in 80s and 90s. President Trump's election and re-election might just be a reflection of the fact that no matter which government comes to power, they are refusing to deal with what these displaced laborers of US require as a collective action by the US governments. And therefore, they've just taken a gamble. The voters have just taken a gamble with a strong man who, in all likelihood, is going to create a lot more uncertainty, most likely in expectation, not going to solve the problem, but you are just gambling, like what else can happen? So let's go, maybe he's going to disrupt the way things are going, and maybe that will create a path for the right solution. In my opinion, the more likely outcome is that there'll be a lot of uncertainty, a lot of pain, and then ultimately, somewhere either through a visionary leader or through like think tanks or some blueprints of reforms, finally, US might embrace that we didn't really deal with 1980s entry of China into the trade with the right reforms we could have done at our end. That, we've just done financial band-aids and welfareism rather than actually improving US on health, infra, and education, the three fundamental things that a government should provide, that the US has been slipping on, just like many other countries of the world, or maybe unlike many other countries.
So sticking on the topic of globalization and concentration of market power. So, I think this is a global phenomenon, right? Globalization has been accompanied by the rise of the so-called superstar firms, right? These large firms. And you've been quite vocal about it, particularly in the Indian context. And you've pointed out that rising industry concentration is probably fueling inflation. It's also probably responsible for low private capex that we have in this country, because these are large monopolies. However, globally, the rise of the superstar firm phenomena is usually viewed as some sort of, there's usually some sort of an efficiency argument. These are more efficient firms, and that's why they become larger, and so on and so forth. Why are you so concerned about the rise of a concentration of market power in India?
Yeah, why don't I start with the US first? So usually when I start talking about Indian concentration, someone or the other sends me an email the next day saying, why aren't you writing about the concentration in the United States? So when I put my Brookings paper out, actually, someone very high up in one of the Indian conglomerates sent me an email. I wish you were writing about the concentration in the United States. And I had to send him a link to my colleague and co-author, Thomas Philippon's book called The Great Reversal, where he has written exclusively about the rise of concentration in the United States related to in similar industries in Europe. And so the main reason was I thought that this was going on in the United States. People had documented it, but in India, we had not documented it. So I thought I'll do it. But let me start with the US. I think it's fair to say that in the US, gradually, at least as per Thomas Philippon's book, he calls it the Great Reversal, that US sort of gave up on antitrust. Increasingly, somehow the perception is that mergers that lead to concentration are always necessarily leading to more efficiency. And the reason why, in the end, the argument for US comparison of concentrated industries to less concentrated industries, saying Europe doesn't always stack up, is because somehow on innovation front, because of high R&D expenditures, the nature of venture capital and private equity industry in the United States, the ability to have quick and exits in the equity markets or in resale markets from one VC to private equity to serial private equity deals, etc. And, the whole university network, the continuing drain from rest of the world of the best minds wanting to go there to do research and then join the whatever local economy there is around the thriving universities, that somehow keeps US at the cutting edge of innovation. And so while the market power seems high on the pricing front, and Thomas' book documents quite convincingly that on many fronts, US prices, like for example, if you look at prices in healthcare for sure, on drugs, in X-rays, medical procedures, if you just look at simple things like cable TV, AT&T's cost for wireless, it's very clear, having lived 7 years in London and then moved to New York back, is that, you know, the US is expensive on these fronts, but Europe doesn't seem to provide the cutting edge products as quickly as US seems to provide, and that's because innovation is still at a high level in the United States. So I would say it's sort of a mixed-edged sword. Of course, if you go back to the original theory of innovation, Philippe Aghions' work, in fact, argues for some concentration. He actually says that innovation leads to externalities, and an innovating firm doesn't internalize that through your innovations, you're actually creating several innovation spillovers. And he actually argues for some concentration. I'm still not convinced that the US reversal on giving up on antitrust is justified, but at least I can see the forces working in the US in this direction. The reason why I focused on India is because, in my opinion, the political economy of Indian conglomeration is completely different than the one in the United States, where there is some sort of a general ideology of deregulation, etc. My sense is that's not the reason. I think it's not that we had big antitrust for private companies, which was very hyperactive, and therefore there wasn't conglomeration. It was just that everything was nationalized for most part before 1990s. Then we de-reserved a large number of industries after the 1990s reforms. So for a while, concentration came down in India because we moved away from a high concentration of public enterprises in the various sectors through entry of private firms in the industry. So if you look at the data, it looks like until about 2013, 14, 15, overall concentration in Indian industries was coming down as a result of de-reservation done in 1990s and then the entry of foreign firms. What seems to have changed in the last 10 years, however, is that the private firms that became larger players by taking over the market share from state-owned firms, then have now started building their own market concentration. So if you look at overall concentration patterns, there is what one might call as a great reversal in India, which is that we moved away from public sector firm concentration of our industries by privatization. But now we have allowed private sector giants to actually take on very big shares of the industries where they are. And to me, the political economy of this is that in 1960s, we had a very central, 1960s and 70s, we had governments which really wanted a lot of central power. What does a centralized government want to do? When it creates growth or delivers welfare or achieves both, it wants the central government's label on it. Okay, that's what a centralized government wants. They want to be popular with the masses by having attribution of what's happening in the economy as not that the government enabled this growth through its reforms. The government actually is the one that delivered the growth for you. Okay, that's why Indian banks were nationalized. So those of you who were at the banking talk that I gave yesterday, I was explaining that Indian banks were nationalized in 60s and 70s because the then government and notably one prime minister wanted foot soldiers on the ground saying, my bank that is nationally owned will give you credit at the last mile. And so if your welfare improves, it's because I'm actually delivering welfare to you at the last mile. Now, what we have learned over 40 years of having nationalized banks is that when I was at RBI, I always talked to, whoever was driving the car, or maids at home. And they said they also didn't want to bank with the public sector banks in India. They said we walk in and we don't get the basic deposit services. Branches are crippled because they were undercapitalized, they were cutting back on staff, etc. So gradually, even the very last mile consumer that the public sector banks were supposed to serve were moving away. And of course, we achieved a lot of financial inclusion then through digital finance and its foray. So basically, that model has gone bust. But I think, in my opinion, we now have again a government that prefers centralized delivery. It wants credit for growth that's happening in the economy, not through enabling necessarily the market reforms and rekindling their spirits, but by saying, no, we have actually delivered growth to you. We have delivered welfare to you at the last mile. So when I travel in India, I always look at the billboards at the petrol pumps. And there is always some yojana that is being advertised with a few faces that you can imagine which faces I'm referring to. But that is the plan. That is the new welfareism delivery that is being planned. So one, of course, the digital India has become a key weapon for the delivery of this welfare. But what's the growth mechanism? In my view, they've realized we don't need foot soldiers. We need 5 or 6 army generals in the country. And who are these army generals? They are the big 5 industrialists of the country. They can pick up the phone and tell them, roll out bandwidth over the next year. We will make predatory pricing okay for you. Okay, you can go ahead and do whatever you want for the IO of this sector. You are free to achieve the delivery of the bandwidth. We have a state election coming here. Please go and announce 2 factories that you're going to set up in this state. We need infrastructure push as our growth model for the next 2 years. We need you to take over these projects. We'll ensure that the projects get allocated to you. You will look the most competitive because you're anyway concentrated. You have access to better factors of production, etc. So in my view, this is actually a conscious industrial policy of the current India, that we will create national champions. They will deliver growth. These national champions will be seen by the people of India as the towering figures that represent modern India. A big part of central government is that they have to look very big compared to you. If you went to any communist country, every government building, you have to look up, like to look at the first floor. Because the whole idea is that you should feel small relative to what the government achieves. That's a very big part of a centralized delivery of growth, welfareism, etc. That they have to look giants and the individuals have to look up to all that is getting achieved out there. This may sound a bit critical, but I'm not being critical at all. I'm just saying that's the mechanism, that's the delivery. That's how you think that the identity of the current India is aligned with the centralized growth and welfare mechanism and the 5 national champions that are delivering this with the support of the government. So in my view, it's a conscious industrial policy. And it has some costs because there's costs to giving up on competition. And the costs are exactly the ones you mentioned, which is that while they are delivering on government programs when they want, and of course, these were chosen as the best 5 industrialists of the country. So they are good at executing projects, but they may not be doing these projects at the time when they would have wanted. They are doing it at someone's phone call or someone's insistence on doing it at the time they want. So there's some quid pro quo. They get some preferential allocations in other sectors, some preferred M&A deals when they are happening. So a lot of the M&A that's happening in India over the last 10 years, the share of the big 5 industrial houses has become very large in the M&As that's taking place. Second, their private investments look very good on their balance sheets. And why? Because when they do an M&A, it looks like CapEx on their balance sheet. But all that they are doing is calling the CapEx of another company their own. So it doesn't change the aggregate CapEx. It's really that the CapEx of the national champions is looking as thriving. And they then can charge higher margins because they've concentrated market power, etc. And then along the line of Thomas Philippon's book, I did a we looked at a whole bunch of efficiency metrics, and we found that entry in the sectors where the large industrial companies are building their market power, like steel, like cement, etc., entry is very limited. So even though the sector has high market to book, there isn't much entry in these sectors. Uh, Markups are very high in the sectors where the industrial giants are present. And I think the big question is the one that Chetan raised, which is why is it that if all this is efficiency inducing, we are not seeing high levels of private capex in the economy? So my sense is that they are delivering a little bit on the growth and infra front. Digital India is delivering on the welfare front. It puts the centralized model of growth and growth attribution of the present government, sort of, it keeps things being popular. But I think we are paying a cost for it in terms of lower investments, lower growth, lower job creation, and slightly higher markups and prices for everything that we have. It's very hard to do a welfare analysis of all this. But one big cost is that they are also being protected by tariffs from outside. So our local tigers are not tigers internationally. So there's a tendency to compare us with China and South Korea. But I think it's a wrong comparison because China was manufacturing for the rest of the world. Samsung became a giant in electronics while it was being championed as a national large company of South Korea. That's not what we are doing. We are creating local tigers, but there's not a single product that they manufacture that I use in neon, for example. Whereas I do use products produced by large companies of China and South Korea. And so I think we are producing local manufacturing, which is not yet necessarily of global competitive scale. And therefore, we are not able to create large-scale jobs because we have to partake in global manufacturing to make that happen. But our national tigers are not allowed to become part of that because they are protected in competition from us. Let me stop.
Yeah. So let me switch on to a slightly different topic. So is deglobalization a climate threat, right? And the reason being about 50% of critical minerals, such as lithium, nickel, cobalt, graphite, etc., which is needed for clean technology, are concentrated in countries like China, Chile, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I think you've also written about how large corporations and institutional investors can act as catalysts for the green transition. So can you elaborate?
Yeah, I think climate is going to be like another interesting aspect of this war, which is happening slightly differently in the sense that in the name of deregulation, most likely Trump administration will peel back some of the apparatus that EPA and the Biden administration have created, both to phase out brown technology and also simultaneously subsidize green technology and innovation in the US. I haven't witnessed it because I haven't been to China of late, but I'm told China is moving very rapidly in technological progress, in green technology, electrical vehicles, etc. I'm told there are parts of China where you just have to drive on the road and batteries are getting charged as you drive electromagnetically through what has been laid out on the roads and so on. So one, it could be that US finds itself that if climate change and what climate scientists are saying that ultimately, no matter which government you are, you will have to fight with the consequences of climate change. But if US regresses on this path, they could find that they have technologically lost out, and China has actually prepared itself, having lost out currently in the trade war, but preparing itself maybe for the next war that might arise on the climate front. That's one. Second, I think it's also quite possible that US companies will ultimately prevent the Trump administration from maybe peeling back as much as they might ideally want to. In fact, fossil fuel majors had themselves started reorienting themselves. Some of them have invested in carbon sequestration technology. Some of them have themselves bought green renewable firms. So, wind energy generation is very large in Texas. Solar energy generation is very large in California. And some of the majors are actually involved in some of these technologies. So it could be that the private sector actually pushes back. And in the work that we have done, what we are trying to highlight is that if governments lack credibility on climate change, firms may themselves actually start committing to longer term target goals, because maybe private companies and their shareholders are more long term than an individual administration in power might be. And so they might still pave the path for transition by saying, no, let's keep innovating on our own. If we are successful in green technology, there will be spillovers, then others will innovate, and then it will become cheaper for everyone to do the green transition. And then it doesn't matter that we don't have a government that's committing to imposing carbon taxes, etc., because we can form our own pathway going forward. Now, what's the downside? The downside could be that they try to curry favors with the Trump administration. And in the process of doing that, they say, okay, let's just move away from transition and let's just look aligned with the Trump administration. So I think we have to see a little bit how the US corporates play this out. But I think they could play quite an important role in green transition. And I think green transition could be an important part of the trade war, where if US regresses, China could start looking better positioned to deal with the future than the US is.
Okay, so I have one final question and then we'll open it up to the audience. And so this is, I think there's a lot of interest now because of Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. So global debt has become something that everybody's talking about. So you have rising debt ratios all over the world. It's more than 400% in advanced economies, 300% and counting in China. It was okay up to a while because debt servicing ratios were low because of zero interest rates or negative interest rates, quantitative easing, credit easing, so on and so forth. But now, we are in for a period, presumably, of maybe higher inflation, higher interest rates. Do you see an impending debt crisis? And is there any threat to the dominance of the dollar?
Yeah, I think that probably is maybe one of the most sobering sort of macroeconomic constellation of parameters globally, which is that Western economy or developed economy or world developed economies debt situation looks basically like post-World War II, right? And in some cases even higher than that, without actually there having been yet World War III. Part of it was after global financial crisis, part of it was steady welfarism that was building up even before, and part of it was ramped up also at the time of COVID. I think the only thing I can say in terms of how it may play out is to just rely a little bit on long stretches of histories. So Barry Eichengreen has a very nice book describing how periods of high levels of debt were dealt with. Tom Sargent, my sort of colleague and Nobel laureate in economics at NYU, he also has several papers describing how high levels of debt post-wars were dealt with by these economies. And you basically see two patterns. One is that it takes a long time. Once you have debt levels on the order of 150%, 200% debt to GDP, it typically takes 10 to 20 years to bring them down, move from fiscal deficits to fiscal surpluses that are required to actually stabilize the debts. So that's one. But the second question is, along that path, what happens to the macroeconomy when the debts are coming down? And two things happen. Some economies allow inflation to rise to moderately high levels beyond what they might consider as what their central bank should target, etc. In many of the episodes, there weren't even central banks, or there wasn't inflation targeting, etc. But so moderately high has to be interpreted with some reference level of what might be reasonable inflation, like 5%, 6%, etc. So typically you start seeing 8%, 10% inflation as being on the horizon as a possibility. But second, you also see austerity, you see cut in public programs, social spending, increases in retirement age, cutting back on pension benefits, increase in taxes on household corporations. And all of that is associated with a certain level of reduction in growth that comes with it. And many countries either default on their debt also, in spite of them being. So the reason why France had a very short period as a global currency, reserve currency of the world was because Napoleon just kept defaulting on the debts after each war that he performed. And then the world said, okay, we need UK because even though it's also colonizing and sometimes fighting wars, it does a counter-cyclical debt management policy unlike France. And so UK sort of got the reserve currency status at some point. But default is one way that countries can deal with debt, but then they lose their privilege of being a safe haven. So sometimes countries do engage in financial repression the way emerging markets do, pushing their banking sectors to basically buy a lot of government debt. Central banks are told to do yield curve management and buy a lot of government debt to repress sort of yields for government borrowing and so on. US did that after the war. Many people think Japan invented yield curve control, but actually it was Federal Reserve in 1950s after the World War II to deal with the debts. There was almost an explicit agreement that Fed was on the one hand given autonomy, but was told that he will manage the yield curve for the government debt, financial repression and yield curve control. So I think, in my view, all of these things are on the table. So at a recent meeting I basically said that to me, it looks like all of these emerging markets, some of them are now submerging markets. Some of them look like emerging markets on macro constellation, but they have good institutions. They have historically had the safe haven status. The world is borrowing in their currency. Central banks are parking their reserves in these currencies, etc. So at best, some of them look like benefiting from the historical safe haven status. And perhaps US has still some exceptionalism because of the various issues I was mentioning, of course, besides being the largest economy or largest per capita GDP, growing economy, high per capita GDP economy, a lot of innovation, etc. So I think US looks, in terms of what might one expect, looks more like an exceptional emerging market. Sort of like emerging market macro constellation, but an exceptional superpower. So it's like a very interesting development that we probably didn't have other than through wartime outcomes. But what happens is usually when you come out of war, there is great innovation that has happened, which then starts making into consumption products. But it's not clear that debts that you take on to deal with global financial crisis or COVID-style responses, that kind of innovation benefit that a war has. A war also has a lot of reconstruction that has to happen after that, also adds to growth in a short period. Maybe COVID had a little bit of that, but so I don't know. Overall, I think what I'm trying to say is that a lot of uncertainty and probably all of these things that we used to think about in India, financial repression, muted, protracted growth, high inflation periods to liquidate government debts. All of this now may be on the table in advanced economies of the world.
But no immediate threat to the dollar as such.
Yeah, I think it doesn't seem to be, though I would say that incidents are happening. You know, the snap election in France in June is very clearly associated with a rise in its term premium relative to Germany. So there is a breaking point at that for France away from Germany. Both in 2011 and the 2023 debt ceiling episodes in the US, which you could say as a political risk, but US still did the right thing in the end, which is what American exceptionalism is about at some level. But in the 2 months leading up to the debt ceiling, US was losing its exorbitant privilege in the borrowing markets. UK very quickly lost its privilege when you had the Liz Truss budget and the bond vigilantes immediately hit them very hard. So my sense is, even though everyone says nothing is happening, actually small incidents are happening. And to me, this is like hearing the canary in the coal mine. That to me, these are basically likely predictors that all these fiscal strains that I'm referring to, which will play out in the macroeconomic scenario, austerity, defaults, um, higher inflation, repression, etc., may all start beginning to take hold in advanced economies in some form.
Okay, so now I open it up to the audience.
Let me actually crack one joke to lighten things a little bit, and then we can take the question. So when I presented my Brookings piece on the concentration of Indian companies, so I was talking about this public sector banks and the nationalization, etc. So I'd taken the name of the Prime Minister, and so I had said that the nationalization of Indian banks